grandson of President and Mrs. Nixon. He is also the vice chairman of Brightsphere and a non-resident fellow at the Lichtenstein Institute at Princeton University, and of course a member of the board of directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Would you please welcome Christopher Nixon Cox.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it's great to be with everyone here tonight. This is really an exciting night for me because to introduce someone like Fred Haise, it's just a dream of mine. And I have to point out a couple things, which is, of course, the Apollo program and space exploration was so important to my grandfather. All the Apollo missions took place during his presidency, all the lunar landings did. And of course, Fred Haise and the Apollo astronauts on Apollo 13 were awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by my grandfather. So there's an intertwining, a strong relationship between my grandfather and our space exploration program, which of course, all the credit doesn't belong to him. It was really a big program across multiple administrations, but a lot of the exciting stuff happened during his administration. So it's a lot of fun for me to be here tonight. And then of course, as a movie buff and someone who loves Apollo 13, literally my favorite movie, how exciting is it to introduce someone who is truly an American hero in so many ways. So I think it's a rare occurrence to have someone like this in our presence. I'm very excited for this presentation tonight by Fred Haise. But just a little background in case you don't know all the details about him. Fred Haise was a military man who had degrees from the University of Oklahoma and also got a degree and studied at Harvard Business School. He was a fighter pilot in the Navy, in the Marines, not the Navy, in the Marines, and was also a test pilot for the Air Force. So he has a varied career, one that was extraordinary even before he went to NASA. And of course, as NASA, he was intimately involved in the Apollo program. And of course, as part of the Apollo 13 mission, Fred Haise was scheduled to be the 6th man to walk on the moon. But fate would have a different plan for him. 3 days into Apollo 13's mission, a faulty oxygen tank exploded and caused catastrophic damage to the command module and imperiled the mission and the crew. But in the days and hours that ensued, the entire world was captivated as the greatest minds on Earth and our bravest astronauts in space above the Earth worked tirelessly to bring the Apollo 13 crew safely home. That mission has been called technically a failure, but it was actually, I consider it, one of our greatest success stories. And here's the reason why. That drama that ensued over the week in 1970 in April, over that week it showed that through cooperation, determination, and a little luck, mankind can accomplish anything. And that was such a great message for the world at that time. Think of what the world was like then, with the United States embroiled in the Vietnam War, with China and Russia fighting a semi-hot war across the Amur River, with tension in Eastern Europe, with tension in the Caribbean, communism on the march. This was a time of great tension, yet this mission united the world. People from Moscow to Havana to Washington prayed for the safe return of these 3 brave astronauts. And I think that message, their safe return, is a great message for the world that shows that when we're united and we cooperate, we can accomplish anything. I think my grandfather said it best when addressing Mission Control days after the successful rescue. He said, I think I can truly say that never before in the history of man have more people watched together, prayed together, and rejoiced together at your safe return than on this occasion. You did not reach the moon, but you reached the hearts of millions of people on Earth by what you did. Finally, your mission served your country. It served to remind us all of our proud heritage as a nation, to remind us that in this age of technicians and scientific marvels, that the individual skill still counts, that in a crisis, the character of a man or men will make the difference. I think that lesson is one that has so much applicability today. Fred Haise had the incredible fortitude and determination to never give up, to keep working the problem, and we are so lucky and proud to have this accomplished man here tonight. Fred had a front row seat to all that unfolded back in 1970, in April of 1970. And now tonight, we will look forward to hearing the history of Apollo 13 from one of America's greatest pilots and astronauts. I present Fred Haise.
Thank you. Thank you. Thought I might give a little preamble to how I got to this point to fly this mission back in April of 1970. Coming up this next April will be the 50th anniversary. I started with NASA in 1959 as a test pilot. We call ourselves research pilots. Incidentally, at the total annual salary of $5,640 is on my Form 50. I knew right away this career was not going to be make me rich, but I basically followed the Neil Armstrong. Neil had also started at Lewis Research Center, now named Glenn after John Glenn. And he was about 3 years ahead of me, and he moved off to Edwards. Got to fly the X-15 there at Flight Research Center, now named Armstrong Flight Research Center after Neil. And that was kind of the mecca, the biggest area NASA had in flight tests. So I obviously wanted to follow Neil, and I did. Right after he left to go in the astronaut program, I transferred to Edwards Air Force Base here in California to Flight Research Center. And at one point, Neil came back to visit, having been down at Houston working in the astronaut program, Gemini program at the time. And Don Malik and I met with another fellow pilot and asked Neil, what's it like being an astronaut? And he thought a minute. Neil had a way of thinking clearly what he was going to say. And he said, well, he said, you sit in a lot of meetings. You sit in a simulator a lot, and there's not much good flying. So that was what Neil's interpretation of being an astronaut was, and he was kind of right, but he was comparing it to a Flight Research Center where I was involved in 3 test programs at the same time. I might be the chief pilot on one. I'd be an evaluation pilot working on another one, and doing support work like X-15 program was still going on, so I'd be chasing the X-15 or checking the upper range lake beds or weather checks, those kind of things. In fact, I talked back at Flight Research Center about 6 years ago. They wanted me to talk about the old days, and I showed 2 pages it took on a PowerPoint to show 1 month out of my logbook. And in that 1 month, I'd flown 9 different types of aircraft. So that was kind of the good flying Neil was talking about. You didn't get much of. We had some T-38s we got to use as taxi cabs to run around the country to go here and there. But we basically wasn't engaged in what I'd call flight test type business. And to train for space, you can't. There's no trainer you can do in advance like an aircraft simulator or anything. The only thing we had was those fixed base simulators. You did lay around in a lot, getting ready to fly. So at any rate, I moved into the astronaut program. I finally decided, well, what turned it was, I said if I'm going to get to go to the moon, which seemed pretty exciting, I'm not going to get to it if I stay here at Edwards. So I applied and was chosen to go into the program in 1966. This is actually several of us from Edwards at the time were chosen. You see the group here that were all in flight test, and some of us had been in test pilot school together. They got chosen in that crew at selection at that time. Myself on the left, Ed Mitchell, who landed on the moon on Apollo 14, Charlie Duke, who landed on the moon on Apollo 16, Al Warden, he was the command module pilot on Apollo 15. Joe Engle, of course, on the right, flew 2 shuttle missions, but in his career, he did fly the X-15. In fact, Joe is the only surviving person today who flew the X-15. Everybody else who flew it is gone. The first mission assignment I got is shown here, which was a big day to get. Once you get into a mission assignment, in this case I was a backup on Apollo 8. That kind of puts you in a lineup, you think. So you normally fly 3 missions later as the prime crew. And the backup crew is kneeling on the ground there, and the backup crew on Apollo 8 was Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and myself, that young-looking fellow on the right there. And the prime crew on Apollo 8 was Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. This is, unfortunately, Mike Collins, who had seniority in me, got well. He'd had a medical problem and got pulled off, which is how I got that assignment. So he ended up actually being on the Apollo 11 crew. He was a command module pilot that did the first landing, but I served another backup. I was Buzz's backup, Buzz Aldrin's backup on Apollo 11. And this is a scene in Mission Control at the time of the landing. And you can see over past Charlie Duke there, who was the prime Capcom, Jim Lovell, and past him as myself. Where normal backup crews doing critical phases of missions would be in Mission Control just to be called on if they could in any way lend a hand should something go wrong, because as backups, we trained to go fly the mission, which we demonstrated very graphically on Apollo 13, where we changed the crewman. So we knew the mission as well as the people who flew it, and so it was handy to have us sitting there. Frankly, I never got called on to do anything, but we were there. Now, this was the prime crew now on Apollo 13. Jim Lovell, the commander, Ken Mattingly, command module pilot, and myself as a lunar module pilot. We should have figured something would be different about this mission when 2.5 days before launch, we changed out a crewman. Jack Schweigert in the center replaced Ken Mattingly. We had all been exposed to measles. Ken was a bachelor, had never had measles as a child, and was from the blood samples, was highly susceptible to come down. So he was removed from the crew 2.5 days before launch, and Jack filled in. This is that wonderful beast sitting out in the launch pad at night. It's really traumatic when you're out there. I was out there for both the launch of 8 and 11. I was part of a 6-person closeout crew. I was the last person out of the capsule on both 8 and 11 to help get the crew strapped in. I actually did a switch list, which was over 400 and something steps on both of those missions to get the capsule ready for the crew to arrive. And but it's a magnificent sight with all the spotlights on this big rocket. This is breakfast that morning, launch morning. Deke Slayton, you see on the left side there with us. We had, by this time, we had no dignitaries. I think Lindbergh was there for Apollo 8, and I forget the dignitary that was there for 11 at breakfast, but we had no dignitaries. By the third time you're going to land on the moon, you know, it's not a big deal anymore. Here we are coming out of the O&C building where we got suited up that morning, carrying those canisters. We're breathing pure oxygen. The spacecraft operated at 100% oxygen, 5 psi. That allowed the structure to be lighter, to operate at that lower pressure. So they worried about us getting nitrogen in our bloodstream when the pressure was reduced after we launched. So we breathed oxygen right up to the last minute. In fact, we never stopped breathing. The suit techs carefully did the hose switch out in the capsule, so we never stopped breathing pure oxygen. This is the liftoff. When I was a closeout crew, it's really funny to go out there that morning. I was out there many hours before the crew arrived, and that thing is belching smoke and hissing and from all those stages. It's like a live beast when you go out there when it's getting ready to go. And they climb aboard. The launch itself, even though it's spectacular in terms of the sound and the fury and the highlights of the fire here, out of 5 engines, 5 big engines start, 1.5 million pounds thrust each. There's a lot of things unusual to me being a fighter pilot was not the G levels as much as the shaken. This thing, the four outer engines gimbaled. They swiveled to keep the thing going straight to where it ought to be. And with each of that motion, that was exaggerated because you're way up on the tippy top in that capsule. So you got a lot of jerking around in the capsule, much more unusual than in any aircraft situation. G levels, though, for a fighter pilot, were fairly modest. It peaked at first stage when the engines shut down at about 4.5 Gs. Fighter airplanes, typically the older ones I was flying, you pull 6, 7 Gs in combat maneuvering. Today's modern fighters, they pull in 8 or 9 Gs in combat maneuvering. So G levels were fairly modest. One exciting thing happened on our second stage. We lost one engine 2 minutes early, a little over 2 minutes early. The center engine on the second stage quit, an automatic shutdown from a phenomenon called POGO, which is a fluid instability in the feed lines that causes the engines to, in essence, chug. And it finally got to a chamber pressure that the automatic system shut the engine off. And so we were worried a little bit right there that are we going to be able to make it to the moon? Are we going to have to burn too much fuel out of the second stage and then maybe the third stage just to get in the orbit that we wouldn't have enough fuel to go to the moon? But it didn't take long for the ground to have figured that out, and we had to go all the way. This is now in low Earth orbit. We went into about 110 miles above the Earth and went around a couple of times. It gave us time to check out systems, primary and backup, in the mothership, the command module, to make sure nothing had been damaged during launch. This scene now is going eastbound, coming back over, that's Baja, California, sticking out down there. It's a very, very beautiful view, as you can see from up there. You've seen many of them since on Skylab and, of course, now Space Station. The third engine was ignited by people on the ground. The third time it accelerated us to about 25,000 miles an hour. That allowed us to leave the Earth. It's where we are here. Shot this picture. We're probably not very far out here, probably about 15,000 miles, maybe 20. But as you're heading outbound, after docking with the lunar module extracting it from the third stage, it obviously, Earth grows smaller. That scene right now, I don't have a pointer here, but you'll see that's Baja, California, and above that's California. There's a little white line maybe you can pick out up above there on the land mass. That's snow on the high Sierras. So here we were probably maybe 30 to 40,000 miles out on the way. And of course, as you're heading on out to the moon, it gets even smaller. Now, we went around the backside on our flight because of the problem at a higher altitude than other flights. Normally, on the normal mission as we'd flown it, we would have gone into lunar orbit at 60 miles and then prepared to do the landing. We went around it at about 130 miles. The backside is quite different from the front side. When you look at the front side, that's the only one you see from here. It has those large dark areas. Some people can envision a face in the moon. I can't. But at any rate, there aren't many of those on the backside, and they happen to be named by the Russians. They sent a craft around the moon first, so they got naming rights. And this dark circle, beautiful circle, you see with a little mountain left in the middle of residue, that's Tsiolkovsky. It was named for a Russian rocket designer there, much like Dr. Goddard was in this country. And another one on the backside, this is not as pretty as the other one. This is Sea of Moscow. But the backside overall is much more rugged and rocky looking everywhere, with crater after crater after crater. This is a scene now looking over the skirt of the command module. So at that bottom part of that spacecraft view, that's where the heat shield starts. And we're shooting this out of the lunar module window. That's an Omni antenna you see hanging down there. Now, zero G. This is one of the most unusual things about being in space for me was experiencing zero gravity. You've seen lots and lots of pictures of that in good camera shots, later missions. It's almost euphoric. to be able to float yourself around continually or float objects. And for us, it had an advantage of making the ball volume of spacecraft we were in seem a little bit bigger. The other thing that to me was obviously unusual was looking out the window at what you saw. I mean, obviously we had seen lots of pictures that had been taken on previous flights, but when you're really there looking out the window, you almost have to pinch yourself and say, am I really here looking at what I'm looking at? This is seen in Mission Control where they're enjoying our TV show. That's me on the thing there, the screen. It turned out that none of the networks carried it because it was an old hat by now. But we had planned a show and tell, removed objects we knew had not been discussed on previous missions to do the show and tell TV show explaining something about those various things. Shortly after that, we had the explosion. It was a big bang. These were in metal hulls, the spacecraft of metal. It rang through the structure. There was some feeling of motion, but not like the movie showed. It wasn't very much motion, but we could hear the small 100-pound rocket engines firing, trying to hold attitude. So that was what was going on at that immediate period. Jim Lovell drifted back up to the capsule because Jim and I were both in the limb. Only Jack Schwaggart was alone when this happened. And he made the second call if Houston would have had a problem because they didn't answer Jack. And this kind of gives you, if you look at that, the digits starting time from explosion, what went on during that period. I knew almost immediately when I looked at the instrument panel that we had lost tank 2, oxygen tank 2, and we had two of these tanks. So it was not immediate to me life-threatening because it looked like we had the second tank intact. So my feeling was just a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I knew we had lost a landing. When basically we were a prime and a backup system, we didn't have much redundancy. So if you lost any segment of a prime critical system, normally that would, no matter where you were, that would mean come home ASAP. So I knew without reference in the mission rules book that we'd lost a landing. So I was just sick with disappointment. We then went into an extensive troubleshooting period, and you can see all the way down to 81 minutes. So an hour and 20 minutes, we were working with Mission Control, trying various things of turning off valves, including some even in the fuel cells, to try to isolate the leak and save the second tank. And that's when it became apparent at that 81-minute point that really lost the cause, had run out of ideas. So Jim Lovell and I went to the lunar module. I'd actually left a little bit earlier. Jim told me to go ahead and start getting the LEM powered up. So from there on, it was poor Jack left all alone. Jack Schwaggart was left all alone to go through what ended up being the final shutdown, the CSM dead, you can see at the bottom, at 166 minutes. So nowhere in here was it like, you would think of it like your car going out of the control and you're sliding off the road. It was not it's a moment of fear that way, heart and throat kind of situation. This evolved over that length of time, which you can see is 2 hours and 40 minutes till we shut down the mothership. Of course, that was a new first. The mothership, which is called the mothership, because the mother's always supposed to be there for you, it was never supposed to be shut down. People in Mission Control here who had enjoyed the TV show now were under the gun. In these pictures, these are mostly mission controllers. A few of the management, the guy with his hand on his things, Bill Tyndall, who did a lot of the machinations early on in meetings to figure out how we're going to do this, the lunar mission. And it took a lot of people, more so than in these pictures and more so than in the movie, to finally work through what had to get solved to get us back home. Here's some more pictures. These are mostly astronauts here. You can see Al Shepard, and Ed Mitchell, Cernan Evans, Joe Engle, Tony England, who was a scientist there, hovered over the console. And there's Ken Mattingly standing up there, Jack Schweigert, John Young, Deke Slayton in the foreground. People on the ground, when I got back home and we started talking about things, some of them, I think, got less sleep down here than I got in flight. The way the problem was handled is Gene Kranz kind of took himself out of mission control. He was not much in there, unlike the movie. He went off and formed an alternate mission plan and listed what were the open items, or the action items, that had to get worked to enable that plan to be executed. And rather than use the normal route through the MIR, the Mission Evaluation Room, where if Mission Control had something happen they didn't have a ready answer, and we tried to have thought of everything we might happen, but if occasionally those happened that we didn't know what to do, they would hand it off to the MIR, which is in the next building. Mission Control was in Building 30 and Building 45. Next door was the MIR, Mission Evaluation Room. And double doors, over the doors was a sign. The sign said, "God is welcome, all others bring data." So, but normally that was formalized. It would be written up as the problem, handed to the MIR. The MIR had communication with all the major prime contractors in the country, who in turn had their subs, and some of the major subs they were even directly tied to call on that brain trust to work the problems. Well, Gene worried about that, call it pseudo-bureaucratic process, that we didn't have the time to do it the normal way. So he assembled a brain trust right around him that kind of worked this alternate plan, and then called in specific people for a given issue to be worked that he knew was the best one capable to run with the ball. And he gave them marching orders that said, "You have at your disposal anybody in this country you want to use, but I want you back here by," and he gave them a timeline. "I want you back here with the answer." So those people were really under the gun, that they were given those kind of marching orders. And so that's the way that was worked. Now, obviously, you can see when they ended up going to whoever they wanted, they were probably, certainly on telephone conversations, consultations or whatever, there were actually several thousand people working behind the scenes to work out the things that had to get worked out to get us back. The movie kind of shortchanged that. I criticized Ron Howard, and he just said, "You can only develop so many characters in 2 hours." So anyway, this kind of gives the overall situation. When the explosion happened, you can see start a problem. We were not on a path to get home. If we'd done nothing, we'd have followed that dotted line, and we'd have missed the Earth. So the first critical maneuver was done at 61:30 after the problem happened, virtually at 60 hours. So an hour and 30 minutes after the explosion, we had the LIM powered up, and we used a descent engine, the engine we were supposed to land on the moon with, and we made that first maneuver, which was not a big maneuver, didn't burn very long, to get us back on that path that took us around the moon, to end up around the backside at about 130 miles, and virtually be on a swing around, gravity turn around the moon to get us back roughly to get home. Mission Control got a smart idea, the FIDOs, Flight Dynamics Officers, and said, well, to make sure we have enough oxygen, not oxygen, but water and electric power in particular, they figured out a way to change the trajectory again to get us back quicker, and that was the maneuver you see at PC plus 2 hours, 2 hours after we passed the moon. That was the biggest burn we did using the descent engine. That cut 10 hours off the path home, which put us into the realm of consumables, well, with some margin. We ended up doing 2 more, what I call tweak maneuvers, at that MCC-5 and MCC-7, pretty close to entry, actually, to ensure we're going to be in the center of the entry corridor. Now, this is at the bottom of that chart, right after we did that first maneuver to get back sort of on the right path to come home, Jim Lovell asked me to compute our consumables. I did not compute oxygen at all because we had lots of oxygen, and LEM, descent, ascent stage, plus 2 full backpacks, things we're going to use if we landed on the moon. But I had to compute, I assumed the critical ones were water and electric power. And that scratching down at the bottom is my calculations. And I did show that we would make it on electric power, going down to a power down, I figured, of 18 amps in the LEM. And kind of coasting flight in the LEM, you'd normally be at about 32 amps on that 30-volt DC system. Fully powered up for descent landing, you'd be at about 65. So I was going to take it down to 18 amps. I figured I could get it down to there, not running some equipment I knew we didn't need. That got us back home, at least to entry point. Water I ran out of about 5 hours before entry at that point. But then they did that next maneuver. I showed 2 hours past the LEM, and that bought another 10 hours. So we even had margin on water. The thing I did not think of, kind of dumb, lithium cartridges. We only had 2 small cartridges in the LEM, a primary and a secondary. Our spare cartridges were down on the descent stage, which we were to retrieve had we done the EVA on the lunar surface. And that wouldn't have been enough anyway. So that was really the shortest commodity we had, was those lithium cartridges to get rid of the carbon dioxide building up. Because in a spaceship, you're much like in a submarine. I mean, if you're in a submarine, if you don't do anything, after a while, all the crew, every time they breathe out carbon dioxide. Somehow you got to scrub it, get rid of it, the same way in a spacecraft. I use that when I talk to grammar school children, elementary school, and tell them, see there, it pays to pay attention to that arithmetic. You never know when you may need it. This is the lithium cartridge I was talking about, the fix that was done. Unlike the movie, I was not even involved. I was off duty at the time, asleep in the command module. They had me ripping the cellophane or something. Jim Lovell and Jack did this, built this in a replica they'd fabricated on the ground using what they knew we had on board. And they actually tested it in a chamber in the Building 7, it was, at Houston with human subjects to make sure it worked before they piped that fix up to us to execute. Another thing, a problem we had was we didn't have blank paper. We had no blank paper on board. So we kept doing these various burns you're talking about, and so procedures changed, so we just had to scribble over. Now, we did have 3 different writing implements. We had a lead pencil, we had a Pentel pen, and what else we had? We had just a regular lead pencil, ballpoint. So and there were different colors, so we could differentiate the changes we made by that method. But we had no blank paper, and that was a big problem when we had to copy down the power-up for the mothership. We had no power-up procedure for the mothership, which was never supposed to be shut down, and that was very lengthy. This is just a picture of the LEM cockpit showing some of the warning lights that are on. Those were not emergency or things wrong, really, warning caution lights. That was just because most of the systems were off. Jim Lovell here holding our entertainment device. It was a Sony tape recorder. We had some music pre-stored to play. And it got very cold and damp in the spacecraft. This is me sleeping over on the commander's side. My arms are tucked in like that because in zero gravity, if you don't, your arms tend to do this. And that would wake me up. So I figured a way to tuck them, keep them out of the way. But it got down probably to about mid-30s in the lunar module, and it froze the water tanks in the mothership. The water tanks were still found frozen when they recovered it on board the aircraft carrier, inspected it on the hangar deck. This was a shock when we separated the service module and looked at this scene and saw the damage. That area to the right back there should look as shiny and smooth as that section to the left. That's where 1/4 of the spacecraft had blown off with the oxygen tank event. It just seemed to us that it should have been much worse damage, but I think the thing that helped us was we were in the vacuum of space. If you have a bomb go off here, there's immediate flash around the bomb, but greatly is the expansion of the air shock waves that magnify a bomb explosion here on Earth. There was no atmosphere, so there was no shock waves following that. This is our Aquarius, our landing craft, after we separated it on our way back in for entry. And another small miracle of this program and this mission was we had turned off the mothership for 4 days, like I said, froze the water tanks, obviously violated specifications on all the electronics, the avionics. It came back to life. Jack Flaggett was in command for entry, but he let it fly auto. He was obviously monitoring it, but he let it fly auto through the computer, and we had the second most accurate splashdown of the program. Only Apollo 10 did better. This is part of the recovery operation. The Iwo Jima aircraft carrier was used. The aircraft carrier had been on combat duty in Vietnam, and it was on its way home to San Diego for its home port. And they swung south by the Samoan Islands to pick us up as part of a secondary mission for that aircraft carrier on the way back home. And people in Mission Control here celebrating. 3 flight directors in the foreground, Jerry Griffin, Gene Krantz, and Glenn Lunny. The other primary flight director, 4 of them supported the mission, was Milt Windler. Again, people in Mission Control celebrating. Unusually, after flights, they normally had splashdown parties at each of the NASA centers, and Mission Control guys went off and had a beer bus. They were all so tired, they did not hold the splashdown party. Of course, the crew never got to go to these, because we were still getting recovered and on the ship. Well, in our case, they delayed it 2 weeks, so we got to go to our splashdown party. We were the only crew that ever did. And this is us coming on board from the pickup in the helicopter on board the Iwo Jima. Now, this was a phone conversation with President Nixon. President Nixon made a call to us after we got below deck, and this is a 3-way conversation here. At this time, I had developed about a day and a half out a urinary tract infection, so that's why my glum look. It wasn't a call from President Nixon. I had chills and fever, and I wasn't feeling very good. In fact, that's a bummer, too. I missed the party on the hangar deck. They had a cake and ice cream and with the crew and the carrier, and I went to sick bay. And President Nixon came to meet us. He flew Air Force One down to Houston to issue the Presidential Medal of Freedom to the Mission Control team. And then he flew our wives to meet us at Hawaii. That's where this scene is, to likewise receive the Presidential Freedom Medals. And he did a further thing. He did a further thing for us after the mission, which was unusual, in that normally there always were state dinners. I attended one here in Los Angeles, in fact, at a big hotel after Apollo 11. And I went to ones at the White House and several others, where it's normally a fairly large group of people. Because of the circumstances of our mission, and I was happy he did that, those are kind of pretty formal, stiff kind of events. What he did was he arranged a dinner, a private dinner in the White House, in a room just large enough with a table, and the attendees were his immediate staff and their wives. So it was just the immediate staff of President Nixon and his wife, and of course Jim Lovell and I and our wives, and Jack Schweigert was a bachelor, so it was just Jack. But he had a very close, intimate event like that for us after this mission, which is different than any other. The second thing he did, which was unusual, was knowing the trauma we had been through, and we're still tired, we're run down. He arranged for a helicopter that night after the dinner to pick us up from the White House lawn and fly us to Camp David. And President Nixon gave us the use of Camp David for 2 days, for the next 2 days for ourselves and our wives. So again, a highly unusual treatment, I'd say, and I was really appreciated. It was great. So anyway, that's kind of my story of Apollo 13. I don't now open up for questions, maybe.
I think first of all, Mr. Haise, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a true treat and honor for all of us to be in here and be part of. Thank you very much. Mr. Haise has agreed to take a few questions. We will go through them, but I would like to ask the first one, if I may. We are in a house of Nixon. You did touch on what President Nixon did after the trip, but all of the, as Chris said earlier, all of the moon landings happened under President Nixon, under his White House. Could you, give us your perspective on the President Nixon, that is, his support of NASA and of the Apollo program?
Well, obviously, any program requires funding, and the president himself doesn't have an open check, but the president has the powers to influence and work with key members of Congress to assure that the funding is assured, and that was done. In fact, it's the last program that NASA, I would say, from start to near the windup, was funded properly per the program plan. So he was obviously had to work to assure the Appropriations Committee did their thing, but he certainly did a good job of assuring that the program was funded adequately to get the job done.
Okay, our first question from the audience, sir.
Mr. Haise, thank you very much, and I find your story absolutely fascinating and appreciate every bit of your service to our country and your example to all of us. My question is, as far as your youth goes, you touched on it a little bit, but what led you, or what gave you the drive to pursue the career that you pursued, and how can that translate to younger people? You mentioned a little bit of your calculations with math and so forth coming back in, but what advice would you give to the young people?
Well, I think a key and for anybody is as soon as you can, try to figure out the talent you've been blessed with, that you've been born with, and how best to marry that in a profession that can best use that talent. Generally, you will be more successful and have more fun doing some of the maybe hard things you have to do to get there, but always have goals set to work toward. And obviously, when you go to work in a job that uses your talent best, you'll tend to be happier day to day and more successful in your career. So it's a hard thing to do to figure out that. Now, I figured it out accidentally, in my case. Obviously, I was born in 1933. Next month, I'll be 86 years old. So there was no space program. And if I had any, I had no interest in aviation. In fact, my main interest I had was in journalism. I had worked on a high school newspaper and got interested. Through 2 years of college, I majored in journalism, was editor of the Bulldog Barks of the college second year, and was planning to continue on at the University of Missouri, which was a noted school in journalism. And the Korean War had come on, and I decided I should serve my country. And my father had always sort of recommended that I take a path that would get me a commission, like the gentleman here in the front row, that you should be an officer. And I looked around at the time, and the only program that fit, that married with 18 years old and 2 years of college, was the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. The Air Force required you to be 19. So I applied and was accepted. I'd never been in an airplane in my life, not even sitting on the ground. So anyway, just the short of the long story is, first time I flew an airplane, it was like heaven, magical, whatever words you want to use to describe it. But right then I said, this is my new career. It's flying, it's in aviation. Of course, I did not have in my mind exactly what that career was going to be, but it was going to be connected with aviation. You realize there's still no space program. Space program had ways to get here. So it was going to be in aviation. So that's how I got in the right path. I talked to a lot of people, I read books, And my next vision and intent was to become a test pilot. That seemed like a good way to apply my engineering degree. I had a degree in aeronautical engineering. And now with some flying experience, I think about becoming a test pilot. And so that's what I worked on next, was to get, I wrote to a lot of companies, sent resumes. My squadron commander in the Oklahoma International Guard had convinced me along the way earlier, because he had worked as an engineer at NACA at Langley, NASA's mother center. And he said, you probably ought to, I'd recommend you go to NACA, because it wasn't even NASA yet when we're talking now. NASA hadn't been formed. And because you fly a lot more different airplanes. If you're in the military, you'll normally get assigned to a test program for a new airplane, but you may stay with that test program and that one airplane for 5 or 6 years to get it through fruition and get it to the fleet or to the squadrons. Whereas at NASA does research, and they take airplanes and modify them to do for different kind of tests for either safety or for more performance. So you'll get to fly a lot of different types. And so that was the kind of the reason then that I applied and joined Lewis Research Center in Cleveland. And that worked out because I've flown over 81 types of aircraft in my career, 9,100 hours roughly. So I've had a good aviation career.
Sir, third row back to your left.
Hello, Captain Haise. Thank you for your talk. It's awesome. Welcome to Orange County. Semper Fi, and Fly Navy. You're a naval aviator. One of the things that most people don't know is that in addition to Apollo 13, you were very well known as well for, it was not John Young who was the first pilot of the space shuttle, it was you. You flew the approach landing test of Endeavour at Edwards Air Force Base. And so I guess my question for you is, a lot of naval aviators joke that they wish they had a tail hook on that thing so they could take it to the boat, and a lot of enlisted Marines joke about being the door gunner on the space shuttle. Any such jokes while you were in NASA from the Marines and the Navy guys?
Right. Yeah, you bring that up. Actually, what I ended up flying was the approach and landing test of the first Space Shuttle Enterprise, where we launched it off the top of a 747 aircraft, and we had an eight test flight programs at Edwards Air Force Base, and I got to command 5 of the 8 test flights we did in 1977. And it was, to me, the highlight of my career, because I was so involved. For 4 years earlier, I had worked in the Orbiter Project Office, more in program management. So I'd worked through the early design development of the shuttle as a manager, and then to go on and get to fly the first flight was incredible. I sweated that flight more than I had on Apollo 13, not from my safety. Gordo Fullerton, who flew the flights with me, we were sitting in ejection seats. The early shuttle Enterprise had ejection seats, so we had a good plan B, should anything go wrong. I was worried about the pilots, crew in the 747, Fitz Fulton, Tom McMurtry, Skip Guidry, and Vic Harton. Those 4 two-flight engineers and the pilot, co-pilot. We worried about if the thing went out of control right at separation, because that's the first time we're going to get to see how the control system worked. If we had drifted aft and hit the tail on the 747, I knew we'd lose probably those 4 people. So that was more in my mind of concern about somebody getting hurt on the flight. The other thing in my mind, though, that was a sort of a big picture concern, was we had changed presidents. The program had been started under President Nixon, and Jimmy Carter had come in, and one of the first things he did after a few months was he killed the B-1 bomber program, and that made us a little nervous about what Jimmy thought of aerospace in general, not directly associated with NASA. And so that was kind of in the back of my mind at the time, that should I have crashed Enterprise, and we had no backup vehicle. So it would have meant a slip in the program of at least a year to 2 years. And we had just announced also up to a 2-year slip in the orbital flight. So all of that was sitting there. So I worried that if I crashed it, that may be the end of the shuttle program right there. It was reflected somewhat by the ground crew when Gordo Fullerton and I climbed aboard that morning, the first pre-flight 1, FF1. we got ready to climb up the ladder. You go in the lower hatch, and we're climbing up to get in our seats. They had a Polaroid picture on each side of the ladder pasted, and it was of these figures wearing a blue flight suit like we wore. They had our helmets on, so I know the suit techs were involved in this. They got their helmets for these figures to wear. The visor down, the oxygen mask dangling, sitting on these huge sweepers machines, the kind that sweep city streets like Chicago or something. In the hangar, they're in a hangar. And the sign said, "If you screw this up, this is your next job." So the workers were a little worried too, that if I made a boo-boo and crashed the Enterprise.
Sir, right section to the back. To your right.
Thank you, sir, for your service first. Secondly, what do you think were the key attributes that you possessed in order to stay calm under that kind of pressure?
I'm sorry, I'm getting old, hard of hearing. Say that again.
What do you believe were the key attributes that you possessed in order to stay calm under that kind of pressure?
I think it's much like just the knowledge base you have, the training you have. I think it's just like you take the professional sports or whatever, when, you know, they're under a lot of pressure. And I think they've been at the game long enough with enough training, enough knowledge of what they're to do and how to do it, that you're confident. It's not say you don't have a little butterflies, but you're confident to the point you think you can handle anything that might go wrong. So it's that, what you want to say, keeps you calm and able to do what you have to do as business as usual.
One of our young students in the back, sir.
Hello. Mr. Haise, you are one of my heroes, and I respect your work and service, not only to the U.S., but for your contributions for the advancements of the human species. My question is, during astronaut training and in the actual mission itself, were there any protocols for spotting unidentified flying objects seen in space? And do you believe in extraterrestrial life?
Can you repeat that? No, that
Her question was, what were the protocol for spotting UFOs? And do you believe in extraterrestrial life?
okay. First of all, there was no formal protocol. Obviously, if we sighted anything, we were trained to report what we saw, normal or unusual. I have to say that all my flying, though, I've never seen anything I would call germane to a UFO. The question is, do I believe in them? I believe there's life elsewhere in the universe. I just don't have the ego. If you understand the universe, that we have we're sitting in one galaxy with a couple of 100 million stars, many of which are like our sun. And then you look outward and you see really billions of galaxies. Every time Space Telescope looked out, they'd see more. And you have that many suns out there. It's just hard to believe that a creator put all that there just for us to go out at night and say, what a beautiful sky. There has to be more to it. I can't, because I have not ever witnessed or seen evidence, I can't say there's been UFOs here on Earth or have visited Earth. And the distances are so incredible with the technology we have. You know, it's a tough job to go to Mars, much tougher than going to the moon. So to think even if we, one of these exoplanets, we found life, we do not have the capability to go right now. We could communicate, obviously, long distance with a lot of lag time in between hello and goodbye, but that situation right now.
Our next question, sir.
Good evening. When you overcame those challenges on the Apollo 13 mission, how did that personally affect you? How were you different when you came home from the mission?
I wasn't different at all in that respect. I know some people had more of a religious effect. Jim Irwin, started a ministry that actually supported military coming back from Vietnam. Bill Pogue became a lay minister, I know. To me, it was just a great adventure. Again, maybe it's because of that little bit of knowledge I talked about the universe and what going to the moon's not going very far. It was kind of an adventure. We're using a different kind of flying machine, but it wasn't anything that struck me that way at all. As far as failures, I've had failures. The story I didn't tell tonight that I sometimes tell as an in-between story between Apollo and Shuttle. I crashed a BD-13 and suffered burns over 65%. I spent 3 months in the hospital in the burn ward at the University of Texas Hospital in Galveston and had a medical team of combination of shrine doctors that worked at Children's Shrine Burn Institute and UT doctors. And we set a goal after I got past the critical stage, and I knew I hadn't breathed too much hot gases, that to get back to flying. So we did some things different in the treatment to assure that. And it took 14 months through therapy to get back, but I passed the flight physical, and I flew Enterprise after that. So it's kind of like what I heard about President Nixon. You get ups and you get downs, and you don't let the downs keep you down. And so it's kind of an episode for me like that.
Okay, we have time for one last question. We are going to get to that question, but I do want to relay one message while I have your attention. Mr. Haise has agreed to take a photo with you up in our front lobby after this program. There's a lot of you. We're going to have to keep it very efficient. You can use your cell phones. I will take your phone from you. I will take your picture. We'll move it along. So please just keep that in consideration when we're doing that part of the program. But our final question is from one of our young cadets.
Sir, I just want to say on behalf of Troy and JROTC, thank you for coming and talking to us tonight here at the Nixon Library. I wanted to ask you a question about some of our cadets have a future of joining the military. And not only as future military members, but as teenagers, I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give us for not only our present lives right now, but our daily lives and our future lives to be better people?
Well, I think the program you're in is one I was in younger. I don't know if you were in then. That I think gave me some of the, call it ideals and character traits was the Boy Scout program. Which was much stronger, I think, back then than it is now, maybe overall. But those kind of things, along with your parents are obviously very key. They're with you all the time. Teachers, other mentors to help shape your character. Sports are good. Sports teach teamwork. But no, it's a combination of things that make you who you are. The only thing I saw when I viewed the library today that President Nixon did that I would not have done is he eliminated the draft. I would not have eliminated the draft. Not that I want my children or anybody else shot at, but I think 2 years in conscription in the military is a good starting point for people to get the sense of, again, organization, of planning, of discipline, that enables them, because many don't really know what they want to do for those kind of years that you normally would be drafted, to help them with a better foundation to move off into what they're really going to do in life. So that's one thing I wish we had never done away with, is the draft.
Mr. Haise, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.